going to go ahead and start. It is 4:01 according to the clock over there. So I'll call this meeting to order. Joint Education Committee with Commissioner Gill, Smith, and Board Member Babb, Bounds, Evity Satterfield, and Susan Horn. So we will start with the presentation. Larson J should be on his way, and I hope to say with Michelle. Yes, sir.
I know our agenda has on here presentation and discussion of Knox County Schools budget, but I believe that Mr. Risky's come all the way from Nashville, and the BEP formula is very important to us on a local level. So I suggest we give her as much time as she needs to help inform us.
Absolutely. So this meeting is just for us to get as much information as possible. So while we do ideally end at 5, if we do need to go over that, I think that's respectable. Because we need to get all the answers that we can. So yes, thank you so much for
We can have Chris come from across
Anytime.
the street and Joe come down next month.
Thank you so
Need
much.
be.
Right.
So if we can have what's the last name? Dursky. Hi, Ms. Dursky. The platform is yours. Thank you.
Does this is? Uh-oh. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here this afternoon and talk about one of my favorite topics, the basic education program formula. Not many people say that, so, but I do. I've been with the department about 7.5 years, and this has been my primary focus since I've been with the department. So this is sort of my area. We're going to have kind of a high-level overview of the formula, and then I'd like to leave a fair amount of time for questions, because typically when we talk about the formula, it generates questions that are specific to the group that I'm addressing. So you'll have some specific Knox County questions, and we'll take time to go over those. But we'll take a look at how the formula works, a couple of recent enhancements that are applicable particularly to Knox County. We'll take a look at the allocation and how-to sheets, and that's the second handout that you see on your place, the one that is not the PowerPoint. A couple of other BEP-related issues, terminology that you may hear that is relevant in budgeting and planning. And then at the end, I've included some resources that you may want to refer to after I'm gone, and obviously always time for questions. So we'll start by talking about how the formula works. I do want to start by saying that it is a formula. Someone asked me last week if there was a committee of people who decided how much money each school district got. And it does not work that way. There is a prescribed formula. There are inputs to the formula that we'll talk about. And the formula results in a number that is the allocation for each of the 142 school districts in Tennessee. There are two parts to the formula. The first part, the formula determines the total funding for each district. And that's done by looking at 47 different components or pieces of a basic education and the associated cost of each of those components. And so the formula will determine a total amount of funding for Knox County. The second part of the formula, which is where the rubber hits the road, is where we determine, via the formula again, how much money the state will contribute of that total, and how much the local funding body or your county commission will be responsible for. And so those are basically the two parts of the formula, determining total funding and then deciding via the formula who is going to pay how much of that total. There are three large inputs to the formula, the 47 components that we'll look at in just a second. 47 items that are inherently necessary to a basic education. The cost differential factor, which is some additional funding for districts that are located in higher cost of living areas, and Knox County is one of those in the current year. And then the most important input to the formula is average daily membership of the school district. So ADM, average daily membership, is critical, and I cannot stress enough, and I'll probably stress it several times as I talk, that is the most critical component of input into this formula. It is unique, obviously, to each district, and the number of students affects everything from the number of positions to the amount of capital outlay dollars to the amount of equipment, material, and supply money that a district receives. So it It is pervasive in the formula, and it is critical to get those numbers right. Not only is it critical to get the enrollment correct, membership is really enrollment, but it's also important to classify the students correctly. Students can have multiple classifications. They can be an English language learner. They can be a student with special needs. They can be an at-risk student or a student of poverty. Those are all student classifications that generate some additional funding in the formula. So not only is it important to enroll the student, but then to correctly classify the student. So that is a critical piece. The 47 components are divided into 3 main categories. One is instructional, and that's really anything you find in a classroom. It's your certified personnel in a classroom or in a school: principals, counselors, teachers, supervisors, any people with licenses who are involved in instruction. Their benefits are also considered in the instructional section. There is a classroom section, and those are other items and people that you would find in the classroom who are not licensed. So it's your educational assistants, your special education assistants, library assistants, and then things like materials, textbooks, supplies, equipment, all those things that go into a classroom that would not be a licensed person. And the third large section is the non-classroom component of the BEP, and that is really all of the kind of support areas. Your superintendent is there, your technology coordinator, and then maintenance, operations, transportation, and capital outlay. So kind of the non-instructional, non-teaching types of things are found in that section of the formula. So we start by determining the total need for the district using the average daily membership, or the ADMs. A school district is funded on its prior year ADMs. So the students that were in Knox County schools last year, that's the number that 2, 3, 6, and 7. And they are weighted, as you see on the PowerPoint presentation, weighted more heavily toward the end of the year. This is designed to give an approximation of what the total year's membership would look like if you kind of average it out over the 180 school days. Given that we have to get these allocations out to you in early July, we can't wait for the end of the year ADMs to begin working on this, and so we have developed this formula of using the average of those 4 months. And then we use 5th month average daily membership for some positions that are assigned based on number of schools that you have and the size of your schools. And those are very specific positions: the principal, the assistant principal, the librarian, and the library assistant. And the way this works, the relationship between your average daily membership, your ADMs, and positions in the instructional section, we use a series of ratios. We use a series of funding ratios. And for example, your K-3 students, these are Knox County's actual numbers for this year. There are 17,802 K-3 students that we're funding. And we divide that by 20. So for every 20 of those students, you earn one teaching position. And so with your total number of K-3 students, you are earning 890.09 teaching positions for K-3. And we do that for each of the grade spans that you see there. We do that for career and technical students, and we do it for special education students. There are specific ratios based on their option of service, which is how much time they spend in specialized special ed classes. There are ratios for English language learners, translators, and then things like art teachers, music teachers, guidance counselors. All of the positions have ratios. And so here you can see where the ADMs are critical. If those are not correct, if they're underreported, you're not generating enough teachers. We do recognize that everybody has more teachers than the formula is going to give. This formula, this is looking at your K-3 students as a whole. So if you had one school, it might work out. But given that you have more than one school, it is definitely a given that you will have more teachers than the BEP is going to fund. And that's, again, where that local support comes in and makes up that additional funding. So any questions on how we determine the number of the teachers? Like I said, it's all in the formula. Yes, sir?
Is it a disadvantage for the large systems because it is hard to break down into units of 20 versus the smaller counties where it's much easier to manage? Is there anything that's in the formula to help large systems with that problem?
There really is not. It looks at each system as a whole, and in some cases it depends on the size of your schools and the number of your schools. There are some large systems that have very few number of schools and they have large populations. There are some large systems that have a large number of schools with smaller populations, and they are affected differently by the formula. But there's nothing in there to address, there's nothing in the formula that addresses that specifically.
Thank you.
So once we've generated all these positions, then we translate that into dollars by multiplying the number of positions by a unit cost for a teacher, which this year is $47,150. So Knox County is being funded for just a little bit over 3,900 teachers at $47,150 apiece. And then you are earning a cost differential factor this year. Like I said before, that's just a little bit of extra funding that is given because your cost of living is higher than the rest of the state. And it recognizes that you may have to pay a little bit more in order to attract and retain some high-quality personnel. And so you get a little bit of a bump in your funding for your instructional positions. Yes, ma'am.
Question on the salary, is that just base salary, or does that include benefits also?
That is just salary. There's only salary dollars. And that $47,150 is not, it's a funding number. It is not anybody's average salary. It is not the state average, your average. It's just a funding number that has been in the formula and been increased annually through the state budgeting process. So I don't want there to be any confusion about that being anybody's average salary. It is not.
Does it represent 75% of the salary?
No, that is the full amount, and then we will equalize that later, the 75 or 70-30 split later. Yes.
How many positions do we, I thought we had like 4,700 professional positions. But the formula has 3,904.
Do you actually have, you actually have more than 3,900, for sure.
What the formula funds, because again, you have to staff the ratio. It's like Mary Ann was saying, in a smaller school, you kind of get penalized a little bit because the 1 to 20 or whatever the ratio is. So the more schools you have, the smaller schools you have, the more teachers you have, the less funding you would get for all that.
If we could teach at Neyland Stadium, we could solve this problem.
Yeah, if we had all of our elementary schools in Neyland Stadium, it would solve it.
One giant school, you'd probably be okay. But yeah, you undoubtedly have several hundred at least more teachers than the formula. There is not a single district in Tennessee that has just the number that the formula calls for. So everybody, even our one school districts have more. So once we've gotten the number of positions, we then look at the benefits for those positions. We fund Social Security, we fund the certified retirement rate, and Social Security, Medicare, retirement, and medical insurance. So every position that is earned in the formula carries with it FICA, Medicare, retirement, and medical insurance, funding for all 4 of those pieces. And so you see there the combined rate for Social Security, Medicare, and retirement is 18%, and then the funding for insurance, for instructional insurance, is $7,038.78 for this year. And the insurance component is actually the actual average of all of the insurance premiums that are paid into the state education insurance program. So that is an actual number based on current participation statewide. Okay, then in the classroom component, we look at things like equipment, like I said, supplies, travel. Many of those the unit cost is developed by using a 3-year running average of what is actually spent by districts. So we take all the data from everybody's financial reports for 3 years, we average that together for equipment, for supplies, for travel, and we bump it up for inflation, and then that forms our unit cost. So the unit costs for this section are in large part based on actual costs. And this slide just talks about where some of those unit costs come from. Textbooks is the estimated cost of the current adoption. Some of the maintenance and operations and funding for alternative schools is just the prior year inflated up. And then capital outlay, we'll talk about that in more depth a little bit later, but that's based on outside publication for what it costs to build schools of various sizes, elementary, middle, and high school. So we get that from a third-party source. It's a RS Means publication, and they're known for their construction work. Those unit costs are then multiplied by the number of students, of ADM. So, for example, funding for substitute teachers is $61.75 per student, so your number of students times that unit cost results in about $3.6 million in total funding for substitute teachers. And it goes, it's that same formula for all of the categories we have in there, all of the materials, all of the supplies. It's based on the number of students appropriate to that, you know, whether it's special ed equipment or CTE travel. We take the appropriate number of students times the unit cost, and that's the funds that are generated. So now comes the part that I think really gets people's attention, and this is where we take a look at, okay, we've got a total number, how are we going to divide that between state and local? We look at fiscal capacity when we do that, and fiscal capacity is a local county's ability to raise taxes for education. It is not how much you actually raise, but it is how much you could raise given a certain set of circumstances, or a certain set of assumptions, rather. We use two models for fiscal capacity in the formula. We use a model developed here at UT from the Center of Business and Economic Research by Dr. Fox, called the SEBR model. And that looks simply at property tax base and average state property tax rate. And then it looks at sales tax base and an average sales tax rate. It looks at simply those two areas and determines your Knox County's fiscal capacity. In general, the higher your fiscal capacity, the more able you are to raise local taxes, so the less state dollars you will receive. Conversely, if you have a very low fiscal capacity, some of our very rural counties without much property tax or retail, they have a very low fiscal capacity. They get a much higher percentage of state funding because they are less able to raise their own. The other model that's used is the model that was used at the very beginning of the BEP, before we merged this with the SEBR model. It's the TAS model, and that comes from the Tennessee Advisory Council on Intergovernmental Relations, TASR. It's a mouthful. That is a multiple regression model. It looks at property tax, sales tax, it looks at per capita income. That's generally the largest difference between the two models. And then it looks at a few other pieces, looks at the tax burden, looks at per pupil sales, and modifies the sales tax calculation a little bit. Puts that into a multiple regression model, which thankfully TASR runs and we don't have to, and then it generates your fiscal capacity. The two fiscal capacities are not the same. In general, the SEBR model favors your urban districts, and the TASR model favors the more rural districts. And you can sort of see that in the next slide. These are your TASR and SEBR for this year. The TASR model is 8.155%. SEBR is 7.9. So TASR is a little bit higher, which would mean, in this case, actually, it's working conversely for you as I look at that. The higher one would give you less state funding. So you are kind of an anomaly. You are a large urban district, but this Tasser and Seba are not bearing out like they do in general. For example, Metro and Shelby, it would be very different.
That's kind of what I wanted to ask you. We're one of the largest systems yet. We have 3 different government entities within our county. The town of Farragut, which has no property tax and dedicates 50% of their sales tax to the school system. The county, which uses some of its property tax for the school system, and 72% of its sales tax for the school system. And the city, which uses 72% of the sales tax for the school system, but no property tax. How does that vary into the model?
The model doesn't look at what you're actually doing. Both of these models look at kind of a hypothetical. If your tax base was taxed at the statewide average, you could generate this much, and then it ranks you with the highest to lowest, basically, in the state. And so, yeah, it's based on what you could raise, given the assumption that you're taxing at the state average and using your sales and property tax bases.
So does that mean, essentially, if you tax your residents more, you're penalized, or you're, I mean.
No, we don't, no, neither model looks at what you're actually doing. It's collecting data on what is your property tax base, what is your sales tax base.
So you don't look at any
It's
actual.
funding. It's a funding formula, not a spending formula.
Right, it doesn't look at what your actual taxes are. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm just probably slow on the math, but the 8.155 and the 7.931, I don't need to necessarily understand those. I just need to know that that's what kind of spits out of the computer from these formulas. Is that right?
Right, and
Okay.
what that means is of the total taxes that could be raised on these formulas, Knox County, under the TASR model, can raise 8% statewide. And given that there are 95 counties, that's a very high fiscal capacity. Many of the fiscal capacities are in the 1% range for your more rural counties, whereas your larger urban districts may be up at 13 or 14%.
And that model number is Knox, Shelby, Davidson County, Hamlet. What are the top, your calculation under TASR as your larger school districts would be?
I'm trying to think, they're in the range of, I think Metro's is somewhere around 13 or 14%. Shelby's is as well.
Okay.
Has there been any adjustment to the formula for internet sales tax and the amount of capacity that we have lost in that?
Not that I'm aware of, no. And these formulas we contract with both of these entities to provide these numbers for us. And so we do have some discussion with them periodically. They make suggestions about, possible changes or if there's an alteration or an adjustment to some of the incoming numbers that they get, but we really are dependent on them.
On fiscal capacity, what as a local government can we do that helps us in the BEP formula? And it just simply raise our local portion?
Well, can I hold that question until we get through the presentation, because I think that's going to open up about 6 more questions, if you don't mind.
Now, the fiscal capacity number, well, we average the two. We average TASR and SEBA together. So the average that we're going to use in the formula for Knox County this year is a little bit over 8%. It's just a straight average of those two numbers. There is a behind-the-scenes formula that then looks at your fiscal capacity, looks at how much you've generated in the instructional section, how much statewide has been generated, and looks at an average split of 70-30 in the instructional component. On average, the state pays 70%, the districts pay 30%. Now, that's going to be different. That's an average. When we factor in your fiscal capacity, we get some very different numbers. And so in Knox County, the state is paying this year just a little bit over 59% of the instructional, and your local funding body is responsible for just a little bit over 40%. So the state average being 70-30, you're at about 60-40, And that is a reflection of your fiscal capacity being relatively high statewide, compared to other systems in the state. So the higher the fiscal capacity, the less state funding. And so that fiscal capacity is used in all 4 of those categories to determine what percentage the state will fund and what percentage the locals are responsible for. So any questions? I want to talk a little bit about enhancements, and then I thought we could take a look at kind of walk through the allocation sheet, just to see how to look at all of these numbers for you and to point out a couple of things that may be interesting to you. And then, again, some of the terminology that we talk about, like maintenance of effort, 3% fund balance, required local match, those are things you hear. I want to talk a little bit about those, make sure we have a kind of a level understanding of those.
Can I ask one other question?
Sure.
And I don't know who comes up with this, if it's the legislature or the Department of Education, but the funding formulas of like 1 nurse per X number of students, 1 social worker per X number of students, who comes up with those numbers?
A very few of those are actually in statute.
Okay.
The nurse is in statute, 1 nurse per
3,000, right?
every 3,000. Many of the other ones are determined by the BEP Review Committee or in the budget process. This year we added a response to intervention position, an RTI position. That was funded at 1 for every 2,750 students. And that came out of the budget debate at the legislature. So the BEP Review Committee, I'll mention them later, but I'll mention them now. That's a statutory committee made up of a broad number of stakeholders. There's school representatives, county representatives, legislators, citizens, other state agencies, members, and they are charged with reviewing the BEP annually and making recommendations to the Commissioner of Finance and Administration, Commissioner of Education, and the Governor.
Do you know if there's anybody in Knox County that's a representative on that board?
I don't think so. You're not on, okay, it would either be you or probably Chris,
Some
so.
of those recommendations haven't changed in 20 years.
But, so, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the answer.
No, there is not currently. They're appointed by the, I believe they're appointed by the chairman of the state board. The State Board of Education oversees that BEP review committee, and the chairman of the board is the chairman of that review committee.
And Knox County has no representation?
No.
I'm assuming other counties, I mean, it's...
There are a few. There's not a lot. Metropolitan Nashville, Sevier County, Fayette County had someone, they've retired. Wilson County. I can get you a list of the members. It's on the state board website, which I think is referenced in the back of this presentation, but I'm happy to send that. Tell me who to send it to and I'll send it, and then you can contact them. They typically meet once in the spring and then several times in the fall. And those meetings are open to the public and they're announced on the state board website. You can dial in and listen to them.
Thank you.
Okay. Just a couple of changes that have happened recently that I think are pertinent to Knox County that I'll mention. BEP 2.0 was an update of the formula that was passed in 2007. And then in 2016, we did another kind of enhancement to the formula through legislation. Both of those enhancements call for the elimination of the cost differential factor. So that little bit of an extra bump that you are receiving and several other large metropolitan systems are receiving is designed to be eliminated over time. There's no timeline in the legislation for when that will happen. It has gradually come down over the past couple of years. It was at 25% 2 years ago, and in fiscal year 18 and 19, it's been at 20%. There is some discussion annually of dropping it another 5% for the upcoming year, but we have no definite word on that. Just something to be aware of. Typically, if that is reduced as that is phased out, the legislative intent has been to couple that with an increase to the salary component so that it wouldn't just be a drop-off. There'd be some offset to it through more salary dollars. And then the other major enhancement recently was for this year, the response to intervention position that was added That is something that is required and had not previously been funded in the formula, but it is now part of the formula, and it's, again, it's based on a ratio of students to positions. Okay, if we take, now this allocation and how-to sheet is the other handout. The top sheet is what we call the allocation sheet, and that's a summary of the funding, the 4 areas of funding: instructional benefits, classroom, and non-classroom. And it shows the total funding, what the state will pay, and then what is the local portion. And we provide this to districts beginning in April. We provide estimates in April, May, and June in this format, and then in July, early July, we send out the final allocation for the upcoming school year. So we try to get that out as early as we can in April, when we have some idea of where the legislature is going with budget, and we feel like we have good data for your enrollment that we can use. And we send these to the school district. Right now they are sent to the finance person and the director of schools. There's also a lot of information on the bottom of the sheet. We show the ADM counts that are used in the formula, so you can see from one year to the next, has your enrollment gone up or gone down? Obviously, an increase in enrollment should generate additional funds. There are a number of districts in Tennessee who are seeing a decrease in their enrollment, and their funding is dropping off or staying level, depending on any additions that we make.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Sort of philosophically or by policy, most every formula has a larger share of state versus local, except for non-classroom, which is quite the opposite.
The average statewide in non-classroom is 50-50. So given your fiscal capacity, you're going to drop below 50, which is going to put, the state's share will drop below 50, which would put the local share up over 50. There is a floor in that component. No district receives less than 25% state funding in the non-classroom. So there are several districts that benefit from that.
Can I go back to asking a question, or I guess you're going to come back to the response to intervention? I'd like to know, because RTI has tiered 1, 2, and 3. Are we speaking of teachers allocated by tier or just total number?
It's just total number. And it's based on the total number of students in the school system. So for every 2,750 students, you're generating 1 RTI position.
Okay. All right.
We show weighted average salaries for the state and the district. We look at your per pupil amount for the IEA program. That's individual education account. It's a special ed program for specific categories of special ed students. That is the amount of BEP funding that would be transferred from your district to the parents of those students who are participating in the IEA program. There are not a whole lot of those students statewide. I don't know if you have any, or you may have a few, I'm not sure. I did not look. And then we show your fiscal capacity index. So this cover sheet has kind of a summary of everything that's in the sheets behind it. If you look on like the second page, where it has all of the teachers, all of the instructional positions, and the ratios at which they're funded, then you can see all of the teachers for each of those categories of students or categories of positions that are funded through the formula. So that, you'll notice too, some of them, the principal and assistant principal, it references the Blue Book. The Blue Book is a little summary of the BEP. It's a 6-page summary. It's on the State Board website. I've included the link here. It's a quick reference to what the formula consists of, and it's kind of a handy desk reference as you're talking about things of this nature. So any other questions on the positions page and how we get to the positions, and then at the lower half, you see how we get to the funding, and then,
Can I ask a question?
sure.
I have a note here that HR and finance are not components in the BEP, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and also professional development is not a component.
Professional development, we take the actual, professional development is included in the travel, in the classroom section where we fund travel. When we pull the actual costs out of the district financial reports for travel, we're including travel within districts, just going from one school to the other, and we're including all the professional development as well. So that is included.
So it's based on actuals?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So
But-
finance and HR are included in the county funding.
That is correct.
And
That is correct.
also, and is it also technology, the amount has been the same, I believe it's been $20 million for the state since 1992, but now has it increased to 40 million?
In 2017, it went to 40 million.
Okay,
And that you are correct, that is the first change since the formula was developed.
okay.
And that was a strong recommendation out of that BEP review committee that year to increase that, given the role that technology now plays in our schools.
I have a question about the formula, because the formula essentially hasn't changed since it was developed. But there are factors, mitigating factors that have changed in the environment, but has not affected the formula. And I guess Mike Edwards is District 2 for this area, and the impact of some of, just in general, in terms of education has changed. Have we not looked to change the formula, release the formula, update the formula? I'd like to hear some thoughts behind that.
It has changed. There have been a number of small changes to it. The basic determining total funding and then splitting has not changed. Things have happened. The English language learner, that ratio has significantly increased in recognition of the number of non-English speaking students that we have in our schools. I'm trying to think what else. Because of course the technology funding was increased, response to intervention.
Do we look at the number of additional schools that have been added? What?
We don't look at number of buildings, and that's a question we get a lot.
That's part of the deficit.
We do not look at the number of buildings that you actually have. Where the growth that you would see in funding would just come from more students. So if you're building more schools because you have more students, you're seeing an increase in funding. If you don't have an increase in students and you're building a new building, there is no recognition of that.
Okay.
And we can look. When we get to the maintenance and operations part, you can see how we determine what the capital outlay portion is. It's based on, again, formulas and ratios of number of students per, how many square feet does each student need at various grade levels, and then that generates a number of square feet that we will fund for you for capital outlay. It bears no necessary relation to how much square feet you actually have, square footage you have.
Okay, and I think that, so will we look at disadvantaged students economically? Has that percentage changed?
That the percentage of economically disadvantaged students in our school, yes, that has increased, and we have redefined that.
That's where I'm going with
Okay.
it. Okay.
It used to be students who were eligible for free or reduced lunch.
Right, okay.
With the onset or the introduction of the Community Eligibility Program through U.S. Department of Agriculture, that program allowed all students in a school that had a certain percentage of free and reduced for everybody to eat free.
Right, okay.
Well, when that happened, we stopped getting good data on who was actually free and reduced. If you looked at a school, everybody was free. Well, we can't use that data to fund at risk. And so the definition was changed in 2016 to be directly certified students are those who are now considered at risk. And a directly certified student is one who's receiving government assistance through SNAP or TANF or WIC. Also, students who are foster students, foster children, runaway, migrant, or homeless. Okay. Those are all included in our at-risk definition. I will tell you that the number of at-risk students by the new definition in many districts was lower than the number of free and reduced. In recognition of that, the funding for, those students are funded at a base dollar amount per student. That funding amount went from $540 in 2016 to $840 in 2017, in recognition of the fact that there were fewer students, but we wanted to make sure we were generating statewide the same amount of money. Now, individual districts may have seen an increase or a decrease in their at-risk funding, but the definition was changed.
Okay.
Yes?
Would the last couple of questions, would it be fair, have all kind of led to the same thing, and would it be fair to say that although the methodology may be the same and has been for some time, the factors that are always weighed, and as things change in our communities, as in our state or our country, those are constantly reviewed on a yearly basis, and to some extent it does change with the times.
Right.
So the math may be the same, but how we apply the math may be different.
Right,
Is that fair?
that is correct, and that is the charge of the review committee, to look at that. In addition, several years ago, Governor Haslam convened a BEP task force, and that was a group of people, again, some school districts were representative, some outside agencies, some legislators, and they spent at least a year over, some different times over a year, reviewing the formula, bringing in people from other states, bringing in some national experts on school funding to talk about the formula and to see what changes could be implemented or what might be implemented. So there has been some high-level look at the formula, and that was probably in 2015, 2016. And then the BEP Review Committee, does that annually. But, it's kind of a moving target. There's so many things changing and so many things we want to fund, and then limitations of the state budget. No matter what is proposed, it has to be able to be funded at the legislative level. And so that's why when the BEP Review Committee makes recommendations, it not only goes to the governor and his policy team and the Department of Education, it goes to Finance and Administration, because they're the ones that ride herd on the budget, and so they need to be involved as well to see how much money we can put towards various factors.
I have a small question that's on the last page of the, in the blue book. Because the average salary for custodians, secretary, and in your system, when were those salaries, what year are these salaries?
They were in the formula at least in 2007, when BEP 2.0 was instituted, but they are increased every year. By whatever the amount we increase the teaching salary component, those salaries are increased by that same percentage. So they do increase every year, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Superintendent's salary as well. Any salary piece is increased by the same amount, or percentage, really. Okay. All right, so that's the classroom component page. Again, if we look at that, that is, this is just exactly what Knox County is receiving, based on number of students in various categories, regular K-12 classroom and materials, and then you can see the associated unit costs there. The non-classroom component, this gets a little bit interesting. When we look at custodians, maintenance, and operations, this is not based on your actual square footage. And we're asked all the time, how many square feet of buildings does each district have? That is not data that we collect. And I don't know, right now we have the capacity to collect that, because that's a lot of buildings. We got, 1,835 schools in Tennessee. I think TASR, our friends at TASR, I think they do collect that data, but we do not. But what we look at is based on the grade level of the students and then an average number of square feet per student. And so your K-4 students are each assigned 100 square feet, grades 5 through 8, 110, and grades 9 through 12, 130 square feet per student. And so in Knox County, that generates you somewhere in the vicinity of 6.6 million square feet of buildings. And that's just in the formula. I honestly have no idea how many square feet you have. But that is that is where that number comes from. It's just ratios and numbers. And then we look at a cost, we look at an average number of students in a school, and we look at a cost per square footage of building elementary, middle, and high schools, and we come up with a total building cost to build all those buildings, and then it's amortized over 40 years. So as if you had a loan, a construction loan, and you had bought furniture, and it's amortized, and we give you that 1/40th every year through the formula generated from a capital outlay sub-formula. Now, that money doesn't have to be used on capital outlay. BEP is very much a funding formula, not a spending plan. So this money, particularly in the non-classroom area, can be used for anything. And so some school districts are fortunate to have their county commissions or their cities fund their buildings. Some fund them on their own. Some you do a mixture. But we do generate capital outlay funding for you. And again, it's based on a series of ratios and unit costs from a independent third party. Any questions on any of that funding before we talk about some of the more philosophical pieces of this, like maintenance of effort, required local matches, and things?
I feel like we ought to get into the philosophical.
Things that hit the budget area more directly. Anything else? Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about some of these other related issues. Now, minimum funding is not something that is affecting Knox County today. Minimum funding typically kicks in when you are losing students, and right now you are not. Minimum funding guarantees districts a certain kind of threshold of funding below which they will not fall, so that even if your students decrease, we're going to hold you to a certain kind of a hold harmless level that you can count on, so that the impact is not overly negative on the district. It does make sense, I think, from a funding point, as if you have less students, gradually that funding should fall, because those students are someplace else, and that funding needs to move to the students where they are. Minimum funding, it's calculated. We look back to FY16 as the base year and adjust that for a loss of students, and that becomes the threshold below which a district's not going to fall. Thankfully, you are not in that position. You are seeing some growth in your students, and you are seeing more money. So hopefully that will not affect you. The state does have a state minimum salary schedule for its licensed personnel. The state board approves that annually, and districts who are below the state minimum on any of those levels are required to raise their salary schedule so that everybody is paid at least the state minimum. Again, not an issue in Knox County. On the subject of salaries, several years ago we went to a kind of a collapsed state salary schedule. It used to be very prescriptive, bachelor's in 0, bachelor's in 1 year experience, 2, 3, master's, PhD. Right now it's bachelor's and advanced degree. And this gives the districts a great deal of additional flexibility in how to spend the salary dollars from the BEP. That was something the state is very much in favor of, alternative salary schedules or of pay performance or bonuses, or allowing districts to have differentiated pay scales, allowing districts to be able to pay for hard-to-staff schools, hard-to-staff positions, subject areas. And with that very prescriptive salary schedule, that was very difficult. And so the change in salary schedule opened the door to much more discretion at the local level for how salaries are determined. So there's no, if the state raises the salary component in the BEP, there is no longer a requirement that every teacher get that bump. That is hard to explain to teachers. That was the case for years and years and years, and that has been, it's been a challenge, I think, to explain that, although it certainly has opened the door for some creative salary schedules and some ways to reward the really outstanding teachers and to keep them. So that was the intent there, but just so you know, there is no prescribed across-the-board salary increases from the state level required. You may have a locally collaboratively agreed upon agreement with your teachers that may speak to that, but from the state perspective, there is no mandatory raises. The required local match, that is the local share of the BEP that is calculated for Knox County. So if you, on the very front page of that allocation sheet, about halfway down, it gives you, it says total required local matching funds, $200,506,000. And so that is the minimum amount that Knox County is required to fund on the local level. And we check that at the state. If you do not, if we do not see at least that amount in your local budget that you submit to us, then we cannot approve the budget at the state level, and you are not eligible for BEP funding. Now, this is not an issue. You are currently funding it over $50 million over that required amount, but for some small districts, this is an issue. So.
Are you on the first page?
It's on the very first page, about halfway down. Right, it's actually right above the line that says additional information. So we do make sure that every district is receiving the local contribution that's required. Mm-hmm. And as I said, most districts, fund over that minimum amount, but not all. The second piece that we look at it when we look at local funding is maintenance of effort. This is similar but not the same as required local match. Maintenance of effort says that a local funding body must contribute at least as much in one year as it did in the preceding year. It must budget as much, it must budget as much in one year as it did the previous year. And so again, we look at that annually when budgets are submitted. We look back to last year and see what you budgeted. We look at this year. If it's at least the same or more, you're good to go. If it drops, we question it. There are a couple of exceptions. The biggest one is if your membership, your enrollment is declining, we can revisit maintenance of effort on a per student basis. And if you're putting in the same amount per student one year as you did the previous year, then that passes. But if your enrollment is the same or increasing, you have to put in at least as much as you did the previous year. There's no requirement currently in law for any increases to local maintenance of effort, but you cannot back off on it. You have to stay at least that same level. Another term that we hear, particularly at budget time, is 3% fund balance. This comes into play if you are budgeting to spend more than you expect to take in new revenue. So if your expected revenues are $100 million and you plan to spend $101 million, then the fund balance test becomes relevant to that, to your district. If you are spending more than you plan to take in, you must have a reserve of at least 3% of your operating budget. Anything over that 3% of your operating budget, you can roll into your budget and spend on any educational item that you want to, as long as it's approved by the school board and the county commission. But if you are budgeting more than you're taking in, that 3% fund balance comes into play. Again, we do check that, and if we do not see that 3%, then we will not approve the budget. And again, without an approved budget by October 1, you're not eligible for BEP funding until things are corrected. So there's not necessarily, people say, oh, the 3% fund balance is required across the board. Not necessarily. That we have districts who only budget what they expect to receive, so fund balance is not an issue for them in this context. Now, I will say it is a good thing to have a fund balance, because your fund balance is kind of your emergency reserve. And I've been in a district where we had a tornado take out a wing of a middle school in the middle of the night. Well, we needed our fund balance to work to fix that, to mitigate that and deal with that. You fire, natural disaster, there's all kinds of things can happen, as we know. And so that fund balance is a good, everybody should have one. I know CTAS and MTAS recommend somewhere 5 to 7%. The law is a 3% minimum, in this case, if you're budgeting more than your expected revenues. But that is not to say that we are advocating no fund balance. We think fund balances are a good thing. And last but not least, growth funding. We will in January of this year, in just a couple of weeks actually, we'll take a look at what your enrollment is this year versus what we're funding. And if we see that you have more students than we're funding, we will rerun the BEP, see what the difference is, and then send you that additional money. So we will, in other words, the state will recognize that you've had growth in your enrollment, and we will send you some additional state dollars to help you deal with that, because undoubtedly you may have had to hire more teachers, you may have had to purchase more desks, more textbooks, some cases you had to bring in portables, whatever you had to do to deal with the growth. And so we recognize that and we fund that. The amount of growth funding has varied significantly in some cases from year to year. We're in a place now where we have about $35 million for the last couple of years, and that funds just about all growth in the state. So if you have even a small amount of growth, you should get a small amount of additional funding. In years when growth funding is limited by the legislature in the budget, we've only been able to fund maybe growth over 1 or 2%. So that leaves the locals having to deal with that first, and 1% of your enrollment is a fair number of students. But this year we have $35 million, and we are just about certain that that's going to fund all growth. So we'll be sending out estimates in February, and then we'll send out a final payment in June. So there is additional money to recognize your current year growth. Okay, couple of slides here with some resources. E-Plan. Are any of you familiar with E-Plan? It's an electronic. It started out as an electronic grants management program. It's now just about our electronic reporting system. It's got everything in there except enrollment, but it's got all of your financials in it, all of your grants, state and federal, your Title I information's in there, IDEA, your state budget, your state financials, reimbursements. So there's all sorts of information in there. There is public access, so you just need the URL, and you can access it without having a login. So there are certain parts of it that are publicly available. And then these are just some articles or publications about the BEP that are pretty well done. The first one, the analysis of the BEP by the Comptroller's Office, is very well written and is written in fairly layman's terms, so it's a good resource. And then the State Board website has several pieces on it. And the Comptroller has a calculator that's an interactive tool. You can put in more students, less students, you can change a salary, and just see how that would play out for your county. So it's an interactive tool that you can use. And then finally, my contact information. So I appreciate all the time and your patience, and this is a lot of information. I know it's taken me years to get comfortable with all this, so I don't envy you having to listen to all this in one night. But are there any other questions? I am happy to.
I think it would be best if we can go back to Randy's question as what would be the, well, Randy, could you ask your question again? Because I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Looking at fiscal capacity and Knox County's current tax structure, what is it we can do to make efficiency to the BEP formula that would best maximize what we can get?
I'm not sure there's anything you can do to fiscal capacity. That really is outside your control. That's based on your property tax base, your sales tax base, and then some state averages, your per capita income.
Right.
I mean, those are basically things that are really out of your control. They're just analyzed by these two agencies to determine your fiscal capacity.
But their determination of our fiscal capacity, it's about the use of our fiscal capacity that we have to work on both. Would that be a fair statement?
I'm not sure what you mean. I'm sorry.
What we dedicate to education
Oh.
as a city,
Yes.
as a county, as a town of Farragut. What are some simple things we can do as far as the ratios? I think one of the problems we have here is we have so many schools and such a large population that we have a hard time making our ratios fit into individual buildings.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is if it's a funding formula, it's not.
Yeah. They're really, short of changing the ratios, you know, if we funded 1 to 19 instead of 1 to 20, that would generate some additional positions for you. The cost of that is fairly significant statewide. But that would be, those are the types of things that the review committee would take up. And then typically if you were to suggest that, say, for example, if you were to suggest a change in the funding ratio for elementary schools or K-12, then they would ask the department to run some what-if scenarios. So if we did that, what would it cost statewide? How many positions would we generate? And those are the kinds of things that we include in the report that we send to the governor's office and the two agencies, because it very often comes down to budget issues, which we're all familiar with. The state's the same way. There's only X dollars, and there's a lot of competing agencies. So I don't know.
I haven't checked recently in the last year or two, but at one time I checked where we stand locally amongst the other school districts on local contribution. Do you know where we stand at Knox County?
I do not, but I could send a sheet that would show percentages above the requirement where you stand in relation to that. I'm happy to do that. We have that information back at the office.
I think that would be helpful. I have a question about maintenance of effort, especially under your note, because if budgeted local revenue is increased during the year after after a budget has been approved, this will increase the maintenance effort for the following year?
Yes.
But is it done by line item or total budget?
Total budget.
Because there are some programs that were in total budget.
Yes, and that's an excellent point. I'm glad you mentioned that. If the budget is increased, the local budget is increased during the year, that amended budget with the higher local contribution becomes the new maintenance of effort level.
That's what I wanted to know. Make sure you say. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
This is on ratios, and I just sort of see some things. I mean, I think we've all heard about the new governor's efforts, and I mean, I've heard the county mayor talking about CTE and, really wanting to increase it, but then when you look at our ratios, the ratios for CTE are much lower than your academic classes.
Mm-hmm.
Where does this come in as people are starting to push agendas, yet the ratios don't really fund well for that? Or don't seem to. I mean, I was at one school and a principal sort of said, if I have to make some choices and I can put 20 kids in one classroom and 16 in another, that's a choice, that's legislated down to us. And as we see, but there's a push to do more CTE, but the formula is not supporting it.
The ratios are in statute. So the maximum class size for CTE class is 20. On average, no individual class can exceed 25. And that's typically because in many cases they are either material intensive or labor intensive, and more of your what we used to call more vocational classes, your trades. It's hard to have a large group of students and manage them and keep everybody safe teaching, welding or auto mechanics. It has been discussion, and I believe it's ongoing, of changing some of those ratios to allow in some of our CTE classes that are not real physical, if you will, they're more like academic classes, of allowing higher ratios in those. There's a pilot going on in Metro Nashville allowing that in certain cases. And so that would, that may be something that, again, someone could suggest to the BEP Review Committee. But you are correct. The CTE classes, we only allow 20 on average in a class, and so I have heard that myself from principals in the district I came from. Mm-hmm. If I can put 30 kids in this class and 20 over here, it's a matter of numbers sometimes.
I think ultimately anyone who wants to push something on a local level has to know that most of this starts at a state level, and if you don't have, if our new governor wants to push X, Y, and Z, then he has more influence on a state level. But there's no sense unless you're going to fund it locally, separate of where the state is.
Yeah.
But I just see it with some of these mandates like RTI where it comes about and then the funding doesn't go with it.
Right.
I can almost see this with there's great ideas of CTE and I think we all agree with it. But if the funding doesn't match these great ideas, then that's where I think everybody gets upset.
Exactly. And am I correct also that there's no money in the BEP for maintenance personnel, security personnel, speech pathologists?
There is for maintenance personnel. They're not funded as positions, they're funded as a percentage of the overall maintenance budget. Let's see, speech. Now, speech pathologists
Are not in the BEP?
are not in here, no.
And security personnel?
They are not, they are not.
So, when we look at that's part of the
Spending
problem.
$53 million over
Yeah,
their
so we
positions
have
on it.
117 security officers that Knox County pays for that we get no state funding for. We have 62 speech pathologists that we get no funding for. We have the BEP for nurses is about 20, and we fund 140. I mean, we have 145.
I take that, let me back up on speech pathologists, I apologize. They are funded up in the special ed teacher, because some of those options of service would, the time that those students are pulled out of class and receiving special services, that would be OT, PT, and speech.
And the maintenance is funded in the maintenance.
In the maintenance, it's a percentage of the total maintenance funding is attributable to personnel. Same thing with operations and transportation.
So our 62 speech.
So any of these issues like she was talking about with like HR, finance, security, anything like that, the local has to make up the difference.
That's
Or
correct.
Basically, the local has to pay 100% on that.
That's correct.
And so also, another deficit is that our average teacher salary is higher than the BEP funding. So we, not only do we pay for the additional teachers, we also pay for the incremental difference for every teacher that is funded.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right.
I mentioned there's probably half a dozen other line items of things that we as a county, as
No.
a school board, decide that we want in our schools that
Right.
isn't
Like-
necessarily mandated by the state that we've decided we're
Well,
gonna
and
invest in.
some that are mandated, like RTI is mandated, but we don't get enough funding to
One for
actually
2,700
implement.
children.
Right.
Yeah, so some of them are mandated by a statute, but we
Well,
don't
certainly,
fund
and
it.
it's, this is where the state level is going to normalize it for everybody versus us saying, hey, one
What do we
nurse
want?
for every 3,000 students is not an adequate ratio where,
Right, so we make it up. So for instance, in looking forward to 2019, the BEP funds about 4,900 positions, but then we have almost 6,400 personnel. So we're paying for 1,400 some positions above and beyond what's allocated.
I know you covered this, Ms. Dursky, but I just want to come back to it. We've heard the term, we're a donor county, so to speak, of when it comes to the whole state, in the sense that we're subsidizing other school districts that are not as big and not as robust in the financial sector. Can you just explain that again of how the amount of money that we send doesn't all come back? It normalizes across the state. And you
Yeah,
explained that well,
you're,
but I wanted to
well, I'll do my best. That's not my strong suit, the state revenue. But I believe you're referring to the sales tax that you send to the state that's used then to fund the BEP.
Correct.
Yeah, a large metropolitan system, I would imagine you are sending more dollars than you are getting back. Your sales tax revenue is probably much greater than $222 million. And that, what happens is it goes into that, pot, if you will, for education, and then is spread out across the state via the formula. And again, your fiscal capacity, which allows you to have higher sales tax because of your ability, your retail and your businesses here. You generate more sales tax, you have a larger sales tax base, you are more able, therefore, to raise your own money for education, so you get a smaller state share.
I've had that
And
explained to me by state representatives in a rather simple way.
Good.
6% is the state's, that portion of the sales tax. And they use that to carry out their mission of equal education across the state of Tennessee.
Yeah. Thank you.
These are the results of lawsuits. The smaller districts have sued in the past for equalization.
Right.
And right now, you have two pending lawsuits cases where school districts are suing the state, again, over the funding formula of the BEP. And they don't think they're still getting enough, even with the equalization that you mentioned, where we're donating more than we're getting back. They still don't feel, because the Constitution says you're supposed to give a free public education.
Free and appropriate.
Yes,
Public
I guess
education.
the battle is over what is appropriate.
Yeah.
And this is all a matter of lawsuits that we come up with this.
And I'd like to ask a question about that, because it's, instead of the ratio of students, the percentage of students, but could you revisit the IEA program under special ed and the 7181
Okay.
that is going to be affected by that? I think I just need to hear
Okay,
it.
the 7181 is your combined state and local, your state funding and your required local match added together. So it's really your total funding of $422,562,000 divided by the number of students that we're funding, which is 58,846. And so the law, the IEA law, says that if parents of certain students with disabilities, with some, I think, 6 or 7 specific disabilities, may enter into the IEA program, withdraw their children from public school, and take with them the state and the required local, the state funding plus the required local match, which in your case is the 7181. They may take that with them and use that to educate their students outside of the public school. And so at the end of the year, we will look at how many IEA students Knox County had, and if you had, 10 for the entire year, we would take away $71,810.
Because even if they return, we don't get that money.
If they return during the year, you would get, we would prorate it.
Prorate it, okay.
And if they go out, I don't think they can any longer go out in the middle of the year. I think they have to go out at the beginning of the year, but I think they can return mid-year, and then we would give you the funding back. We pay them monthly.
Okay.
So we have the ability to rectify that, and we do a true up at the end of the year to make sure everybody comes out square.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes.
Would you say that the most effective tool that we have to influence how BEP funding formulas are set or how ratios are set is through the review committee on an annual basis?
I think there's 2 avenues. I think the review committee is one, and the other is your state legislators. They are the ultimate budget setters. Many districts have legislative liaisons or committees that meet with their legislators regularly. You have some of them drop a legislative agenda. So I would encourage you to talk to your legislators and let them know your concern, so that when these issues come up on the floor in a committee debate, they're aware of the impact on their own constituents. Because that's a pretty powerful tool to have your legislators in your court. And I just want to mention, you talk about the state and local, the shares in that. The BEP was always designed to be a cooperative plan. There was never the expectation that it would be 100% state funded. There's always been, the belief that there needs to be local buy-in. The locals have to have, some responsibility in there. It's just a matter of how much and how that works out. And it is something that's looked at all the time. And as you said, we've had a number of small systems lawsuits. Now we have 2 large systems lawsuits going on. And so, there's always a question of is it fair? Is it fair and equitable? And then the other question, is it enough? And what is enough? What is adequate? And that's a question I'm not capable of answering, but it sure is asked a lot.
Is there a rationale for the 70, 75, and 50% state shares?
That's been in the formula since '92, and so I do not know what that original rationale was. I truly don't know how the 70-30, 75-25, and 50-50 came into being.
I think it's proprietary information. That's what we've always wondered, where that number come from. But per cost per student is how much to be educated in Tennessee? How much is it?
I think the state average per pupil expenditure is somewhere around $9,900.
That's the reason it's very important for me to ask the question. $9,900.
Somewhere, that's on the state report.
I'm talking, and where would I find that?
It's not, actually, it hasn't been published yet.
Okay.
It should be on the state report card when it comes out. The financial piece of the report card should be out there any minute.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it will then actually say what Knox County per student cost is.
Yes, it's going to
as we
give you.
move through this
It's going to
legislative
give you an
cycle,
average
looking
per
at
pupil for
vouchers.
your
Okay.
county, and
That's
then
what
the
I need
state,
to
and
know.
then you can see
Okay.
how you compare state to your
State
local.
Oh, excellent, thank you.
How often is fiscal capacity reviewed?
And the fiscal
Annually.
capacity is reviewed annually. We get updated numbers every year.
And how often has modifications been to it?
That I don't know. Again, CBER, as far as I know, hasn't changed. TASR made well, they made more of a correction in some of the, there was some adjustments to the revenue data that they picked up, and so they've made adjustments. But it's a 3-year average. TASR and CBER both use 3-year averages of all these numbers, so that if there's a spike in something or something changes, you don't see a dramatic effect. It's kind of smoothed out over the 3 years. But the TASR formula is, that really is not something I'm overly familiar with, but thank goodness they're there.
From a committee standpoint, I'd like to wrap up with just a couple of more questions from our committee, and then move on, talk about a couple of quick businesses on our next agenda. Before we wrap up, I'd love to be conscious of everybody's time today, so.
No, you're fine.
Okay. Any other committee member questions? I'm positive that we'll all have more down the road, and I know you'll be available.
Well, I was going to say, you have my contact information there, and feel free to reach out. If several things I said I could send you, to whom should I send those?
Send them to me or to Terry.
Terry.
To
She'll
Terry,
distribute.
well, she'll distribute them amongst the group.
Yeah, okay, good.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
This
This
was
was
very-
very.
Thank you
that was
very much for
very
your
helpful.
attention, appreciate it. Thank you.
My apologies for being late on the way in. My son is in the back of the room waiting patiently as we ran over here quickly after school. I think you, Commissioner Smith, might have addressed that today we likely do not have the time to really do a great examination of the school budget, and we talked about that with our team at the school, and would like to reserve that for a real comprehensive look at it at our next meeting, which will be in February, I believe. Do you have a date on that? I know we said it.
February 20th, I think.
February 20th. What I would like to do is ask in advance of that to have our school team send us information about the school budget, both maybe electronically the school budget and then any kind of baseline information maybe by mid-January, so that we have time to digest it and come to the presentation with questions. So it may already be available, and it may already be through, because we're in the middle of the school year, not next year's budget, this current year's budget. But whatever you're going to present to us, if you could have by mid-January to us, that would help us digest it.
So you're talking about today, what today's presentation would have been?
Correct, yes, sir, yes. And that way we can come, instead of hearing it fresh when we walk in the door, we can come with questions and prepared remarks and everything. Does that seem okay to everyone?
Yeah, well, the schools did a great job giving us the information in our notebook for the budget last year, that you, maybe new ones. We could give
Probably
that
did not get that.
notebook like, that we had for budget. Was excellent to have, I think, so.
Yep.
That
We
you
can do it
and.
And ours is March.
Or there just be three maybe, that didn't get it?
What's that?
That's what
This,
I'm asking.
this notebook that they gave us for this year's budget, when it was coming out and all.
New members are not getting that, so.
I know, that's what I'm saying, that maybe they could just do up that notebook
I can't be here the
for the 3 new
It's my
ones.
daughter's
to
16th
give you all.
birthday.
So it's not the
Would that be,
What is it?
cause that
wish I
twentieth
would.
is not a good day.
We'll send some dates back.
Okay,
We
so
might need to let's figure out, we need to meet about this, but
I
we
wonder
don't.
if we could do the 27th
Of February, or,
instead of the 20th.
the 20th turned out to not be a good day?
I cannot be here on the 20th. But
Let's set it now. Let's-
We'll just send
Do
some
we
dates.
have day
Okay,
on
go.
the hill? Do we have day on the hill?
ours is March.
Okay.
So
My
20th
calendar's
is
messed
not-
up.
Okay. After this meeting adjourns, if you have a conflict the 20th, we'll do our best to work it out, but we have a set date, so let's work on that for now. Does anybody have any other business they would like to present today?
I don't have any business, but just one take, if I might add, just a request. her mention, or mentioned there are multiple lawsuits happening at the state level, that they mentioned that it sounded like there was a talk of lawsuits from the large school districts that we've heard of, and you're also hearing some folks say, the school, the smallers may even be, arguing for the total to increase as well. I guess I'm curious, and it's, as we all go through our budget process, where are these lawsuits in the pipeline, and if they go one way or another, what could the fiscal impact be, up or down? I guess it's just something to get on the table as we go through this year, because I've heard about the lawsuits, but I don't know where they are in terms of.
Ms. Dursky, do you have any further information about the,
Where are those, what's the standing on those, and where?
or where can we find information about those?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. Your best contact would be the Attorney General's office, the State Attorney General's office.
Or our local law.
Or our local law.
He has some
I look
information.
hard right here, I'm here too.
There was some talk of April for one of them being tried, but I don't know if that date will hold. There's been some changes.
They're still in discovery. I mean, the two big ones right now, we talked about this at the board retreat. The two big ones right now are Metro, Nashville, and Shelby County. Chattanooga and Hamilton kind of backed off some. So, I mean, those two are still ongoing, but with their scheduling orders and things like that, I mean, it's estimated that it's going to be about 2 years out.
Okay.
Particularly if there's any appeals and things like that. So the answer to your question, is, I would not expect anything for this year, maybe 2 or 3 years down the road.
Thank you very much. With that, we'll adjourn the meeting, and I want to thank you all. I wish you very, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we will see you in February.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.